Let's now shift our focus to trade. There's just a week to go before US President Donald Trump's reciprocal tariffs of 26% hit India. India's top trade negotiator has extended his stay in Washington as talks enter the final phase to seal an interim deal. Sources say the stalemate continues over agriculture and dairy. The Trump administration is keen on maintaining a 10% tariff rate with India, while the Indian government wants tariffs to be brought down to zero across several sectors. The United States also wants to keep steel tariffs on India at 25%. But India wants an exemption after the early harvest deal. India is also pushing hard for a competitive edge for its labor-intensive sectors in the proposed trade pact. Now, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said that the Trump administration is very close to seal the deal with India. Joining us now to discuss the possible outcomes of the trade talks is Mukesh, President and CEO of the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. Thank you for being with us here on Global Lens, Mr. Aghi. How do you see Scott Bessent's statement saying that US is very close to a trade deal with India and trade deals are on next week's agenda?
No, absolutely. I think the discussion in Washington, D.C. is all about closing a big deal, and the big deal would be India, because so far the Trump administration has been able to only close deal with UK, which is not a substantive deal as compared to India. So from that perspective, everybody is keen to ensure, but it's going to be an interim deal. It's not going to be a final deal because some of the bigger issues, such as agriculture, such as dairy, such as GMO, they will come in part two. But part one is let's close the deal, get the business moving forward, and bring in more certainty rather than having an uncertain environment between the two countries.
Right. We've been speaking to sources in the Indian government through the day, Mr. Aghi, and what they indicate, there is still a stalemate as far as India's sensitivities on agriculture and dairy are concerned. We're pushing hard for concessions and greater market access, a competitive edge for India's labor-intensive sectors. From the Indian side, it seems that agriculture and dairy are the red lines, and the US is still pushing for them to be included in the early harvest deal as well. And the indication that we're getting that India may walk away from the deal if there is too much insistence on agriculture and dairy. What do you think is the status of negotiations?
Well, yes, US is asking to open up ag, dairy, GMO, and those are red lines for India itself. You have to understand when you have 60% of the population working on the farm, you have to protect them. From a religious perspective, the dairy which are fed in the US, meats and other kind of food is not acceptable. India, under the law, cannot allow GMO. So I think the government hands are tied. And we are trying to explain to the US government that let's not push hard on that area. Our feeling is that US will focus on getting first interim deal going and then focus on ag, dairy, and others in the latter part of the discussion itself.
Right. So you're saying that we will have an interim deal in goods minus agriculture and dairy. Would you have any idea as to the number of product lines or the kind of product lines which could be covered in the early harvest agreement?
So our estimate shows slightly over 6,000 product lines, which both sides have agreed to move forward. Also, basically, when India has a $40+ billion trade surplus with the US, India will buy more and more LNG from the US to bring that to the balance itself. So I think it addresses multiple factors what Trump is asking for. Balance the trade between the two countries. By India buying LNG, that's going to bring it down. Open up the market. I think the current agreement opens up the market itself, both for the US and India. At the end of the day, I think the objective here is to take the trade between the two countries from 200 billion to 500 billion. And we strongly believe a reciprocal trade deal, a trade deal which is win-win, will drive trade exports from India into the US and from the US into India itself. So I think what we have to focus is it should not be a win-lose deal, but a win-win deal between the two countries.
Right. What I would also like to ask you that what would be the tariff arrangement? Will it be 0 for 0 or US will impose 10% and India will also impose an average tariff of 10%.
Well, when you say reciprocal, that means if the US is going to put 10%, then India should put 10%. You can't have one country at 0, other country at 10 itself. The whole objective of renegotiating a trade deal was early on, where India's weighted average tariff was in double digit and US was in single digit. And the whole objective is to bring parity here. So I think if US insists on 10%, then India will also insist on 10%. But you have to understand that you are dealing with a economy which is India, $4 trillion with a per capita income of $2,000 versus the economy which is $30 trillion with a per capita income of almost $85,000. So I think you have to bring some semblance of parity between the economy and per capita as compared to both countries itself. I think in order to have a win-win deal, you need to ensure that there's a reciprocity between the two countries.
Right. When it comes to steel tariffs, India has been seeking an exemption. But considering that the US has applied these steel tariffs, 25% tariffs on all nations, is there likelihood of any reprieve for India?
Well, it all depends on President Trump. If he basically feels that India is moving the right direction according to his perception, that he may probably say, okay, let's bring it down to either 10 or 26% as per earlier. But you have to understand, India's export on steel is more closer to like few $1 billion. So the impact is not that big. I think what we have to focus is making sure that our pharma goods are zero, our basically handicrafts, especially jewelry and gems, which is like almost $9 billion exports, are protected. So those are the areas we should need to focus on. Yes, steel is important. And we are seeing that US is putting major tariff on Canadian, European, and Japanese steel. So it'll be exception if India gets it down to 10%, but let's wait and watch.
Right. What would be your hope from the early harvest agreement? If this agreement has to help companies both in the US and India and drive investment, what is the kind of tariff structure that you are hoping for from the early harvest deal?
Well, we like to see zero tariffs, but I think if the objective on part of the US side is 10%, 10% also kind of when you benchmark with China, the overall objective is increase the exports, objectives to move in supply chain from China into India, because at the end of the day, the US cannot bring in full manufacturing back to the US. Today, we have vacancy of almost 400,000 jobs in manufacturing in the US, which we can't fulfill. So what we are going to see is more advanced manufacturing coming back to the US, but India plays a critical role in the other aspect of manufacturing. It could be semiconductor, which is 15 nanometers and above, could be in components or partnership in defense area. So I think what the whole strategy is, strike a deal with India, then basically work on joint manufacturing in certain areas between the countries which have signed a trade deal. So from that perspective, I think it's important that India and US come to an agreement, sign a trade deal, and move on into looking at securing supply chain for the US companies in partnership with India.
Right. Mr. Aghi, always a pleasure having you here on CNBC TV 18. Let's hope we have a trade deal over the next few days. We're taking a short break here on Global Lens, but coming up,